Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, Adi Clevitt here, the host of the System Simplified podcast, where I feature top founders, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And today's episode is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group, where we create, document, and implement processes and procedures so businesses can grow and thrive. And I am so excited to introduce today's guest, Joe Olson. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Adi. Thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. So first of all, a big shout out to Joe Corcoran, because he's the one who introduced us. Joe is the co-founder, together with Dr. Jeremy Wise, of Rise 25, which I've been given a lot of shout outs on this podcast because they are the one who produced this podcast. And they definitely created a huge change for me once I decided to have a podcast, which I enjoy tremendously. And I recommend everyone that is interested in having a podcast to have a podcast and to contact John and Jeremy. So big shout out. Thank you, John, for introducing us. And Joe, it's amazing to have you on the podcast because we're going to discuss today about systems of delegation, how we delegate, and you came up with some systems about it. And I'm always curious about new systems. I'm always curious about things processes that people develop that are actually working for them. So we're gonna analyze it, and we're gonna jump into that, and we're gonna figure out and give our listeners a workable system of delegation and why delegation is so important. But before we do that, let me give you a little bit to our listeners. Go, okay, who is John? Who is Joe? Why is he talking to me about that? I go like, okay, well, you definitely can do that because, so you are a longtime entrepreneur. You are the chair of the San Francisco chapter of Tiger 21, which is basically, what would you say, like a peer learning group or a peer group, a peer mentoring group?
Right. Peer learning group.
Yeah, which is very important. We all need that group. Whomever are your peers, it's very important that you belong to a group like that, because that's like what energizes you, motivates you, and you have people like in a like mindset to yours, or like-minded, that you can actually count on. So that's great. And you held leadership roles in various academic healthcare systems, including UCLA, UC Davis, and Stanford. And you have significant experience in venture capital. And currently you manage an array of businesses spanning sectors like e-commerce, hospitality, and both residential and commercial real estate. So you're definitely an entrepreneur and with a lot of experience. And we're going to discuss systems today, right? So First of all, I want to hear your viewpoint of why processes and systems in a business are so important.
Excellent. I'll start with that. Thanks again. One of the most important things that I see in a system is a learning organization. We were just talking about Tiger 21 and other peer learning organizations. I think when you document and create systems and work with someone like yourself, Adi, to create various sort of platforms and systems within the business, that's a business that can grow and accelerate. I think what you see that has a lot of leaders stuck is that they do have systems, but they haven't documented them. They haven't really thought through what is the system, simplified it, made it so that it's shareable, and brought it into the organization at all levels. So if I were going to try to make a headline around why systems are important, it's around having a learning organization that every time something is learned, it's made into a shareable sort of methodology. There's I've listened to a few of your shows. There's so many ways to do this, and you're really the world-class expert there. But the doing of that makes us as leaders go through a few things, which is one, really understand the system and then be able to distill it and then to share it. And I think when you take those steps, oftentimes what you realize is every business is built on systems. You just may not know what they are, how people are doing them, and they really may not be the systems that you'd hope for to serve your customers. They're just the systems that have really developed somewhat organically. So every time you sort of study a system, distill it down to the really important parts, ensure that those are the parts that you want to build out and have to be consistent. That's like one of the core jobs of a leader. And we can talk more about how that works as we progress through the show.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. It's like, it's the learning, right? I mean, it's basically the memory of the organization, because without it, it's kind of like you can, how can you ever really have a company, right? Or a business, because that is, you don't want to start new every single day, but if you don't have that memory, if you don't have that record of what was happening before and how you do things, then how can you progress into the future, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, you don't have that Groundhog Day. And I think sometimes
That's right.
what we'll see in businesses, you've probably seen it too, is we might be great at the customer facing systems, well documented. We know how to onboard a new team member or a new client. But oftentimes what we're missing is everything after that. So you onboard a client, you sort of walk them through the 9 steps, 7 steps, whatever you've developed, and then you start to do the work. And it can start to become internally, at the minimum, very visible to team members that there really isn't a system after that. And then oftentimes there'll be sort of cracks that shines through to the clients, that we weren't really working from a system. And that's really the worst look, I think, when we're working to help people.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, because that's what we look for, is like the bottlenecks, right? And the points where the system breaks, because, or there are no systems, because, or because yeah, it's the handoff, like from one department to another, right? Or you can have a great sales process because you work with a sales consultant, but after they sign up, then what, right? I mean, what is your operation system? Or do you have a system for quality control? I mean, how do you know that what you're producing is correct? Absolutely. It's a very, very good point. So we talked about delegation, in terms of like, and you are all about delegation, so am I. I really believe that delegation is super important. And without it, you just collapse. I mean, there is only so many things that you can do. And yes, you as an entrepreneur, you probably can do things a lot. I mean, some things you can do fantastically well, and some things probably not, right? But I think we have a tendency as entrepreneurs, even if we don't know it well, to, okay, well, I can learn it. I'm going to investigate it. I'm going to do it. And then I'm going to figure it out. But there's only so many things that we can do, right?
Yeah, I'll tell a short story here. You mentioned at the top my background in healthcare. Something that was very interesting for me when I transitioned from healthcare into the entrepreneurial world is a big surprise that I found. In healthcare, nurses, that's my background, and doctors, that's who I worked with, mostly nurses, doctors, and the rest of the healthcare team. Throughout our training, both academically and then as we, learn in the work and develop as leaders, delegation is core to healthcare. As a nurse, we have something called the five rights of delegation, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So what really surprised me when I came out into entrepreneurial work and started working with other entrepreneurs regularly, even nurses and doctors, is that they wouldn't bring this training that we have out into their entrepreneurial world. It would hold everything so tightly. And one of the lessons that I really depend on, especially when working with academics like PhDs, nurses, and doctors, those are some of my core constituents as far as who I serve, is oftentimes they're great delegators in healthcare because we're all trained to do that, right? It's the doctor will meet the patient, gather the information about the patient, and then when they push that button in the electronic medical record, it's a form of delegation. They give all the information about everything that needs to happen to this patient, and then they trust that it's all going to happen. And so the big surprise that I felt, well, trust and verify, which we'll talk a little bit more about as well. But what I found is when I met those same leaders in their businesses, a sleep clinic, work that they might be doing in education, health work that they might be doing and educating outside of the sort of construct of academic medicine, I almost always will find that they're trying to do the job of 5, 6, 7 people within their business, 10 people within their business, and they completely sort of lost the plot on exactly the thing that they found success with when they were working within the healthcare construct, which is delegation. So this big surprise that I found when I moved into the entrepreneurial world, even working with the same people, is that leaders in their own companies, it's really easy to forget about delegation and suffer from the idea that we have to do it all ourselves.
Right. I agree. I totally agree. But what do you think is what's your theory about why entrepreneurs don't want to delegate? Or maybe don't want, but why don't they delegate, right?
Yeah, this where is it on the screen here? Change starts with you. I've found that when I hear the barriers that leaders share with me, it almost always is with their sort of delegation style and how they've chosen to delegate. The answer to the question that you just asked is almost always like it's like clockwork. They say, I tried it and it didn't work. I had this huge failure and now I just don't delegate anymore because I can't trust anyone. That's, I don't know if, is that what you hear? Do you hear some variant of
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah, I do. But do you think it's really trust that is the issue here, or is it just that they didn't know how to do it and then they basically failed at it and they decided no more?
I think that's exactly right. And that's what I find in the clients that are successful when we work together is that they make a commitment to excellence in delegation. What almost always happened in that failure that you and I are reflecting on is that they didn't have a system, a process, a shorthand for delegation. And so I'll say, how did you tell me a little bit more about that? And they'll say, well, I hired someone new and it was their third day and I wanted them to take over client onboarding. And the whole reason I had hired them is because I had 5 new clients coming. And so I just couldn't stand it anymore. And so I told them, like, onboard those 5 clients. It's again relatively consistent that you'll hear something like this because they waited very late to hire the person, oftentimes due to cost constraints or their sort of version of that. Then they're sort of waiting, doing the onboarding and trying to be really thoughtful about that, but then they break kind of and say, okay, I need you to just do the work that I brought you here to do.
Right.
And when they hand that work off, it is a very incomplete handoff. And so I'll use this as an opportunity to talk about one system really briefly. So in healthcare, we have something, it's called the 5 rights of delegation. It's very simple, but I've even simplified it beyond this because I found that even this is maybe sometimes a little bit more than people look for. So I'll just read it out really quick or say it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. The right task, the right circumstance, the right person, the right supervision, and then the right direction and communication. This
Love
is,
it.
if you talk to any nurse, even the most junior nurse who's just in school, this is like you get a little plaque that says this in almost every nursing school. And so we start from here when we learn in healthcare that we have to think through each of these things. And if we miss any one of these or even any part of one of these, the delegation is highly likely to fail. And
Wow.
that's just like, it seems simple, but I'll also first, maybe let's digest that a little bit. So when you hear this idea, right task, right circumstance, right person, the right supervision, and then direction and communication, what pops for you, Eddie?
Well, that's why I wanted to start talking about each one of them, right? Because, okay, so the right task for me is like, you are going to make sure that the person that you're going to delegate to, they actually are capable of doing that task, right? And it's the right task for them. And they are trained for it. I mean, that's the way I look at it. It's like, if you look at it like in my business, right? If I am going to ask one of my staff members to document a very complex procedure in accounting and I never heard of accounting, it's not the right task to give them. Or maybe
That's
I
right.
hired somebody and maybe I asked them, I delegated that task, but maybe they can do it down the road 3 months, but not right now because they don't have the background. So it has to be the right task where you
That's
have
right.
the
Perfect
person
points.
has it's within their core competencies or their training, right? And it's also, I look at it in terms of the right task is like, what are the tasks that I myself as the business owner should actually keep, right? I mean, like the first introduction to the client should be probably with me and not with one of my junior staff members. So it's not the right task, right? Because otherwise it will set them for failure. And I mean, that's what comes to mind, right? I mean, anything else to add on the right task?
I think the only one, I think you hit the nail on the head, and I love how you got, it needs to fit the person, but it also needs to be like the right time for that task. So as a leader, sometimes like, oh, I just want to delegate this because I just want to get it off of my plate. But I love the example that you gave. This doesn't actually need to be solved for like 3 more months. And if you put this on a team member's plate, they won't stop thinking about it, even if it's due in 3 months. And maybe they do the homework thing and put it right up to the last moment. But you've sort of done something called dumping at that point, which is you haven't thought about like the right timing for this. You just sort of dumped it off of your plate onto someone else's. And the only other, so I would just reaffirm the points that you made, totally in agreement with those. I would add one piece, which is the right task is often also something to think about our own energy levels as leaders. And sometimes there's something that I look at and I'm like, I have 5 tasks. 2 are going to be energizing for me and 3 are going to sort of pull me down. One of the biggest traps in delegation is keeping tasks that we know we're good at, but we could be giving away to someone else. So in my case, I'll use the best example for me.
Yeah.
It's bookkeeping. I have an MBA. I'm sort of not a whiz. I've seen people who are real whizzes in Excel, but I'm pretty good and I can definitely find my way around. And something that might take someone else 2 hours, I can often do in half an hour or an hour. So I would say, well, I won't delegate that because I'm good at it. Other team members maybe don't really love it, etc. So I think it's a bit of an energy audit around tasks when you're giving them, because sometimes the right thing to take for yourself is stretch yourself a little bit, go outside of your comfort zone, develop something you wanted to do more of, but haven't found the time. Because oftentimes those things will just ride sort of almost forever, but those will also be the things that can have an impact on your business as well.
I agree. I totally agree. So that was the right task. Right circumstance is the second one, right?
Yeah, we touched into circumstance. I think the thing
The
there
timing.
is
Yeah.
it can be like the circumstance for the team member. I think this is just like adding into what's already pretty obvious, but sometimes there's a team member where the circumstances aren't really a great fit for them. Maybe they've had a sort of altercation with that client and you'd like them to do this, but giving that task to them is going to be sort of 10x stressful this time, or maybe you'll do it behind the scenes with them and then you take the client side work or something like that. So I think really trying to think through not just all the things we were sort of talking about the work itself, but think about the person who's receiving the delegation. What's their circumstance? Are they under sort of undue stress right now? And if they are, sort of going back up to the task and timing and things like that and sort of readjusting.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, I can also see it like in a project, if their plate is full, it's not, I mean, but maybe they can be very good at doing that, but it's not the right circumstance because then it's going to be a loss because they're not going to be able to complete it.
Yep.
Another thing I was thinking in terms of right circumstances, let's say they might be able to do it, but let's say, it takes them 2 hours to do it. You can do it in half an hour.
Right.
The customer needs it within 45 minutes, so they're going to lose the deal. If you give it to them, they're going to get just stressed out and are not going to be able to complete it. So it's not the right circumstance. It's better that you do it yourself, but then spend the time training. So when the circumstance happens again, they will be able to do it in 45 minutes.
Right. It's like, do it with me this time. We're going to run together. But then next time you got to know this is going to be for you. Yeah, totally.
That's right.
And that goes to the right person as well. We're talking a little bit about their circumstances. I think it can go the other direction sometimes where it's like, we know we have one team member who can really do this and they can do it fast, but we have the junior team member who, if we sort of do a double delegation almost, where we delegate to the person who's been doing it and they can do it fast, now you need to go train the junior person and you can elevate yourself and you can move up to other tasks. There's a great, I think it was an HBR article about giving away your Legos. And it's a really wonderful article because what it talks about is when we get, we get Legos, we get used to building something, we're great at building it. Then it's, once you get good at it and you've built the model, you really do need to give those Legos to someone else. It's like, you understand how to do it. You built the little thing and it looks the way it was supposed to look on the box, right? Don't tear it down and build it again. The next step is really take it apart, give the instructions and the Legos to the next person in line. And then you go down to the supervision, direction, and communication, guide them to do it. So sometimes there can be this like double level delegation where you tell the senior person, the person who's experienced on your team, hey, now it's time for you to give away your Legos. And then that's a different type of delegation where you're monitoring the delegation process itself. And that's sometimes pretty fun and interesting work.
Absolutely. No, and I think also, like, when you look at the right person, it's also find the right person, right? Is identify who is the right person that you can delegate to. Because maybe, you realize that, maybe the marketing aspect of your business, it grew and it's just you don't have the time to do that, or the branding, you want to rebrand, right? And you don't have to spend the hours to spend, but you can then go, okay, the right person to delegate has those characteristics, or they have those qualities. So then you hire for that particular position. So then you can delegate to the right person, right?
Yeah. Or, and this is a little bit self-serving for both you and me because of the type of work that we do, you can find an expert who's already hired someone like that, or you can bring in an expert, like in your case of sales and marketing in particular, or some of the work we're talking about now about process management and improvement. Sometimes you don't need to hire. You just need to bring in an expert for the arc of, sort of getting the work done that you'd like to get done. And sometimes I think entrepreneurs are like DIY by definition. That's how they got there. And that's what sort of the definition of entrepreneur. And it is easy to overlook bringing in an expert partner. I think, bookkeeping, oftentimes we're quite good at it. Sales, oftentimes we're quite good at it. But when you get into leadership development and process oriented things, it's oftentimes harder for entrepreneurial leaders to give up that part of their sort of leadership persona and hand it off to an expert. And so those are the leaders that you really do see unlock, I think, when they think about team member, but then also like, who else in the world is an expert? Do I have someone in my peer group? Is there, a teacher, etc. in this space? And that's where I think oftentimes you see people really unlock their leadership.
I agree. Good. So we're talking about the right person. So we were right task, right circumstance, right person.
Supervision, direction, and communication. So I put these three, I feel like these are like their own little process and system. So they're separated out for a reason. Let's talk about that briefly, and then let's talk about how they work together. So supervision is simple. That's management. It's, I gave a task, I gave a timeline, and I need to check in and make sure that it's working. A huge failure mode of most leaders, especially people that are figuring out delegation, is they stop there. They just, if they even do the supervision at all, because oftentimes it goes task person, that's delegation. So we're trying to sort of flesh it out here in maybe sort of like if there's 5 stages, you'll see this around the 3rd or 4th stage where they add a supervision component where they check in on the task. They've given clear enough instructions that there's a timeline included. And so that's, people say, oh, I'm like advanced now. I'm doing great. And they oftentimes miss direction and communication. So they'll just ask questions like, if it's a 10-page thing, how many pages do you have written, right? That's not really going to give you great information, but that is what people oftentimes think of as management or supervision. Like, oh, I checked in. But if you bring in supervision, delegate, direction, and communication, now you're starting to talk about leadership. They say, oh, I got to the 3rd page, but I'm stuck on this, right? So if you ask the question, sort of, where are you and what has you stuck? You've opened up an opportunity to give some direction, to sort of guide them and sort of open 2-way communication around the project, where you didn't just ask like a closed-ended question that just has like one answer. Oh, I'm on the 3rd page. You've opened up the opportunity to really flesh out like what's working, what's not, and how can I contribute as a supportive leader, as a servant leader to you, to your success in this project that I've delegated to you. So I see them as all together, but I also see people sort of feel like they've plateaued up to supervision and lead and, really just doing management, and they miss the leadership opportunity to bring in communication, direction, and really supporting the person who's doing the task.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And the last one is my favorite, probably, is the documentation part, right? Is the way you actually have the process in place. So tell me about that one.
Yeah, let's reflect on nursing and documentation. So this is another thing that just mystified me when I came out of healthcare. So the trope is that in these big academic institutions, the policy and procedure manual, I mean, it will go off the screen if I sort of like to think about how they really are. And I think people say that's a flaw. There's like so much documentation that you could never learn it all, and you can't follow it. What I would say is, that's the backbone of the work, is this policy and procedure manual. Now, are you going to every time go check it for this thing and that thing and the other thing? You're not, but a person who's new in the organization, they will. And that's the beauty of it, is that oftentimes we have this structure also in healthcare, which is called novice to expert. There's great studies that have shown a novice should not be trained really by an expert. A novice should be trained by someone who's just a little bit ahead of them and is just sort of guiding them because they just got good at the last, the step right in front of the person behind them. So in this idea of novice to expert, that all this documentation serves everyone, but it serves the novice in a way that's different than the intermediate person, and it serves the intermediate person in a way that's different than the expert. And so taking in this thought process around novice to expert and this documentation, it also is a great thing to be able to communicate around, right? Another healthcare sort of byline is, if it's not documented, it isn't done. And we have shorthand where we'll say, I did this thing per the protocol. And that way you documented that it got done. And then you didn't have to write down everything that you did. You just referred back to the fact that you followed the protocol. And everyone now knows, if you did really follow it, how it went. And that you'll see this coming up in things as significant as like court cases, or the way that sort of laws are changed related to healthcare, is they'll refer back to these policies and procedures and see if it's still, how to say, like the state of the art. And part of the state of the, keeping policies and procedures relevant is they have to stay alive. And oftentimes the right thing to do there is give it to the junior person to audit it. Go watch 10 people do this and see if they do it according to the policy. And usually they won't, but that's a great opportunity to now update it and bring it into the now. So I love your addition of documentation. In fact, I'm going to bring that into my practice, because I think in healthcare, documentation is so endemic and almost maybe sort of hated. We wouldn't bring it up, but we do so much of it. But I love the reminder to bring documentation into the entrepreneurial world as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So did we cover all 5?
We did. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
a way of making this easier, which there's sort of 2 shorthands that I'd love to share as well. So if you want to do that, I'm happy to move on to the next phase.
No, please. Yeah.
2 easy ways of sort of making this from a little more complex healthcare world into just how can you remember it, is the one is just remember the 5 W's. If you get the who, what, why, when, where, right? Every time you pass something off to someone, you just think 5 W's, you're going to solve for most of the 5 rights of delegation. Now, I think the 5 rights of delegation obviously bring some depth, and I love our conversation about it. But there's a shorthand there, which is who, what, why, when, where. Just 5 W's. If you get that right, every time you pass something off to someone else, you're it's like the 80-20 rule. You're 80% there if you can get that right.
Absolutely. I agree. Good. So what other tips can you give entrepreneurs in terms of delegation? I mean, they will start, they want to delegate something. Maybe they're not going to be successful the first time, or the 100th time that they try, and they have to, it's a trial and error, etc. What advice can you give them in order to actually persist and persevere?
A way of thinking about delegation that I think has really worked for people that I've since have given it 100% and still felt like they failed and were sort of really stuck in this space is the idea of compound interest. So this isn't a healthcare example, and I'll sort of go over to the finance world just for a second. But if you think about compound interest, like you have to put the investment in to yield the results. And oftentimes what I hear from entrepreneurs is, I gave that story earlier, I invested in delegation like $1, right? So even if you have really great compound interest and you only put in a penny, you're still, it's going to take you a while to get to something that is really valuable. If you start with even $100, when maybe the other version that we talked about earlier is a penny's worth, that's actually going to turn into wealth relatively quickly. And so I think this idea of compound interest works for some people. If they think, well, I gave it sort of a fair shake and I tried this and it didn't work, and so now I'm done with it. I oftentimes, when we delve into the details of how much they invested and what they invested, we'll find 2 major sort of points where it didn't go their way. One would be the investment was so low that it should be relatively obvious that the compounding interest is also going to be low. That's one. And then the other would be they got the who part wrong. We spent a fair amount of the time when we went through the rights of delegation around people, because the task itself, in a way, is sort of the simple part, but it's the people that are more complex. And so those are the two things that I usually find is the investment was low, but they feel burned on the whole sort of idea. And then the second major one is the person that they invested in the delegation wasn't really the right fit for the role.
That makes sense. Makes total sense. So you have to really evaluate which one and then act accordingly.
Yeah.
Good. Joe, if our listeners want to get a hold of you and learn more about you, how can they do that?
The easiest way is just stop by our site, remarkablefreedom.com. We can collect your email there. I can email you. You can call me there. You may get me. I may be on a podcast with you, so they may get my voicemail, but they can find my contact information there. As of the airing of this, which I don't know your exact timing, that site will be very complete. If we're sort of building now, and what we're doing now is we're working directly with clients on this and proving it. And the rollout, I suspect, will be in the month of October. So we're sort of a little bit ahead as you and I are talking now, but I think when the podcast comes out will probably be perfect timing for people to find our program there.
Excellent. Okay, so I definitely encourage our listeners to do that. And Joe, I really want to thank you for being a guest on this podcast. I mean, it's definitely a wealth of information, and definitely go check out the website and contact Joe, learn more. Delegation is super important, and get the help that you need in order for it to be successful. So thank you so much, Joe, again, for being a guest on this podcast.
Thank you for having me. And I look forward, I feel like we have so much more to talk about. So I look forward to the next opportunity.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.